Welcome to the Chain Reaction Podcast, brought to you by the Department of Supply Chain Management at Arizona State University's W.P. Carey School of Business. With a rotating cast of faculty, alumni, industry experts, and guest contributors, this podcast aims to help listeners understand the people and processes that produce and distribute products around the world. In today's session, Professor Hitendra Chaturvedi from the W.P. Carey School of Business discusses supply chains and risk management with Professor Arash Azagegan from the Rutgers Business School, Professor and Supply Chain Management Department Chair Thomas Kull from W.P. Carey, and Professor Kevin Dooley from W.P. Carey. Let's join in on their conversation.
Welcome to the podcast on supply chain topics that we all care about as they impact our lives. This is brought to you by the Supply Chain Management Department of the W.P. Carey School of Business at Arizona State University. Today, we have another exciting podcast on risk management in supply chain. And we have assembled a stellar panel to talk about the topic. Starting with our ever-smiling departmental chair, Professor Thomas Kull, followed by the illustrious Kevin Dooley. And finally, we are honored to have our guest from Rutgers, Professor Arash Azagegan. And I know if I really messed up your name, I apologize, because I'll follow up with my name. I'm Hitendra Chaturvedi. And I know, don't blame me, blame my parents for my long name. And I will be the host and the moderator of this podcast today. So again, welcome all.
I think you pronounced your name incorrectly, Hitendra.
Sorry?
I think you pronounced your name incorrectly.
I did? I know. It's the accent that happens after living 30 years here. My mom would slap my hand. So without further ado, let's begin. Eeny, meeny, miny, mo. First, let us catch Thomas by the toe. So I'm going to lob the first question to you. So here goes. Risk management is not a new thing. So we have done risk management pre-pandemic, but post-pandemic, the risk management profile or the risk profile has actually changed a bit. If you were to take into account all post and pre-pandemic risks and kind of boil them up and pick your top three, what would that be and why?
Well, thank you for the question. And, in some ways, risk has decreased after the pandemic in some ways, which is maybe a nice, fun, controversial statement. But I think we've learned a lot about our supply chains that we didn't before. And I think the pandemic has helped highlight the vulnerabilities that previously we probably didn't even realize we had. So risk, just quick academic, is the likelihood of loss. And the way I look at it, the three areas that I would say to look at are upstream, downstream, and midstream, or inside the organization. Obviously upstream, we have known shortages, but we also have what we did some research recently on hidden product changes that with the squeeze on suppliers, they're making decisions that we may not even realize. And so upstream visibility is probably one of the most important, both in where the supply is coming from, but also who's making decisions. And we can get into shrinkflation if you want, Hitendra. Midstream it would be inside the organization. Risks occur due to decisions being made inside the organization all the time. And we also have research on that, on ways in which personal preferences and choices influence what gets done. And, that could definitely be a problem, particularly with promises being made to your customers. Overpromise, you create risks. Simply by promising too much. So being very careful internally. And then obviously downstream to customers, one of the things that I think that is a risk area to think about is when your customers are dependent on other sources, you're fine supplying to your customers, but other sources are not. All of a sudden, demand drops simply because they can't keep up with the totality that they need, your downstream customers. So you could very well end up in a demand shortage simply because of other supply challenges that your customers are having. So there's a sense of the network effect. So I think upstream, downstream, and midstream need to be always looked at and should be part of any risk management program.
Thank you. Arash, do you have anything to add or just vehemently disagree with Thomas?
No, certainly not a disagreement at all. I think all I can do is to compliment what Tom started. I'll start with one element that, as far as risk and list of risks that we had, that fascinatingly we did not include in much of the literature or the textbooks related to risk management prior, and that is related to labor shortage and skills. I think that one hit us like a brick wall, so to speak, in recognizing that particularly in pandemics or elements of disruption that affect human nature or human health or human behavior at the personal level, that has a significant impact on a larger scale at the systems level. So, and we're still dealing with it, right? Everybody is hiring right now, yet at the same time, we're getting used to having to wait, at Starbucks longer for a coffee or Panera Bread or whatever it might be. So that's one. The second one that has been something we've been advocating for a long time, more than 15 or 20 years. That is, and Tom, you mentioned this as well, is related to visibility. To put more context around that, folks don't recognize that almost 50% of disruptions occur at beyond the first tier, second tier, third tier, and upwards. And so, but regrettably, when you ask manufacturers, service providers, whatever, their visibility pretty much stops at the first tier. And I can give lots of stories related to that, but I'll stop there by saying, we just need to have better recognition of what's going on as far as what our upstream tiers provide. One example would be Mattel and lead paint from a long while ago as to how that created significant issues with them. And then the third one is, I'll go kind of counterintuitive on this. Everybody talks about black swan events. And perhaps COVID was a black swan event. So, same with 9/11, Katrina here in New Jersey. But the studies that we did shows that, believe it or not, when you look at the long run, small disruptions, what Tom mentioned within the organization, these are little trickles, droplets of damage, if you will. And so from an operations management standpoint, when you add those up, believe it or not, on a yearly basis, they add up to be quite a bit of damage. So I'd like to think that minor risks, if we just do a good job of handling those, we can do a much better performance. If we can just avoid small flus, I think companies lose a lot more days of work for flus or just a common cold than they do with regard to COVID. So something to keep in mind in that regard.
That's a very good point. Kevin?
I'm going to go meta on you. And so these are risks that are happening right now and will happen and dominate the landscape, I think, over the next 3 to 4 decades. So climate change, both in terms of extreme events. We've got a heat bubble over the Southwest right now, for example, as well as changes in particular in growing regions, so forests, fisheries, food. I'll echo Arash and say labor, but at a meta level. So we've got, migration is illegal immigration at one border is our obsession. but migration is a huge macroeconomic issue across the globe. And coupled with that are demographics. And if we think climate change has some uncertainty in terms of its impacts, demographics are predictable and knowable. We know there are some tidal waves coming there. And then I'd say the third meta risk is the end of whatever. So if we end up having some type of macroeconomic transition, the end of globalism, the end of democracy, whatever it might be, that sounds a little risky to me. So,
No, thank you. This is fantastic. So at least now we have three unique risks that you have identified, some at meta level, some at tactical level, that you think will bubble up. Arash, I will begin this one with you, and this is the hot topic these days. Some people call it risk mitigation, some people call it differently, but we are all part of or aware of the phenomenon of globalization. Books have been written about it. Was going all into globalization risky move? And in the present day, this all-in philosophy towards nearshoring or onshoring, is that a risky move? Why do you think, or why not?
I think we need to go back to the fundamentals and the basics of sourcing, outsourcing, make versus buy, the fundamentals that we cover in supply management. Fundamentally, there's nothing wrong with sourcing, nor is it dependent on where we source from. One thing that folks forget about is that when we outsource, it doesn't necessarily take us off of the responsibility. I'll give an example that I give in my classes as quickly as I can. I hired my a teenager to mow the lawn in the backyard. And I thought, okay, great, this is outsourced. I don't have to worry about it, right? Well, she comes back home, back inside, and the back lawn looks like, a mohawk, the disparity. And so, but who's responsible for that? The neighbors aren't going to say, oh, your teenager didn't do a good job. Be like, well, gee, Dad, you're an idiot for doing so, right? Ultimately, manufacturers, wherever they're located, are responsible for suppliers wherever they get the material from. So outsourcing, offshoring per se, could have been done very well, so long as we have monitoring, so long as we have checks and balances that they're done correctly. The same issues can happen with nearshoring and onshoring. So if we do not have the proper checks and balances for that. Now, granted, it does make it easier and quicker to respond. But I think given the benefits that we have gotten from offshoring and outsourcing overseas, it behooves us to throw the baby out with the bathwater, so to speak.
Very interesting. Kevin, do you have any thoughts?
I think that we're going to see barriers, many barriers towards nearshoring or friendshoring, but I do think it's inevitable because of growing logistics costs and because of the economic development opportunity. I think, if you consider, for example, Arizona, there's been talk amongst people in Arizona, could we make this a textile manufacturing state? We have the cotton, we have the hemp, we have even the used polyester from, carpets in Phoenix. And so I don't know if we'll ever have a actual end-to-end textile value chain in Arizona, but it gets you thinking about economic opportunities. And I think out of this thinking, we'll spin some productive outcomes. In Tempe, we have a business incubator called Fabric that houses over 200 small textile design firms. And that's a type of circular economy, shared resources, entrepreneurism that has stemmed from this idea of how can we bring textiles to Arizona.
So you're saying that there is a balance because earlier we went all into globalization versus now people are talking about all into nearshoring or friendshoring. So the risk part of it. So Thomas, do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, bad idea. Bad idea. All in either way. it's there is no one silver bullet ever, and it's a multi-dimensional decision. And the biggest risk is people going all in blind, that's more of a risk than the inherent risks of global versus. I mean, if I onshore something and I don't have let's say I don't have the capabilities to maintain any of the equipment that I've just onshored, I'm going to be down in 3 months. And I'll be down for another month, and I'll be making promises that I can't deliver. And like I said before, risk is a probability of loss. And if I lose my confidence or my customer's confidence in me, that's very risky.
Thank you. Kevin, Thomas and I, we were talking on the side, and I'm coining a term, which you will get a chuckle out of it. I'm calling it shore washing.
Or shore wishing.
Shore wishing.
Yeah.
A pun on greenwashing, because again, it is some of them are doing it just because it is the in thing to do. So anyway, thank you. Next question is, I'll start with you, Kevin. The 3 risks that you identified, what do you think would be a mitigation plan for these risks? What do you recommend to be a mitigation plan?
We eventually have to monetize carbon, and that's not going to be it. We're going to monetize water and soil and all sorts of stuff, but we're going to eventually move those externalities into the economic framework, which makes them addressable. I think we have to have honest discussions about migration and demographics, and that's something that cuts across political divides and whatnot. And I think, even in the short term here, the question of what we do with Mexico and Latin America in terms of these nearshoring opportunities, and is there infrastructure, is that what needs to happen to facilitate those opportunities that will arise. And then the big meta question that would get someone the Nobel and maybe even beyond that, how do we find business success separate from growth? And as long as business success is dependent on growth, then I don't know how we get off that roller coaster.
Thank you. Thomas?
I like having conversations about risk within organizations, and being probably one of the biggest threats is lack of candor and lack of if you surround yourself with a group of people, any manager with people that are afraid to speak up or to identify a potential hotspot. So one thing about risk is that it comes and goes and you don't even know it. We're not talking about, when you talk about risk, it's not disruptions. Disruptions occur and the risk is gone. You know the situation. Risk is when nothing's happened yet and you're living in this likelihood of loss situation. And these things come and go. And unless we can identify them, we remain blind. And when we're blind, we cannot manage them.
Okay. And let's start with you. If you were to grade companies based upon your experience on how they're managing risk, because it kind of segues into your answer, if you want to do it by industry or by geography, totally up to you, what grade would you give them from A to F? Well,
I like, so we brought up shrinkflation early on. Shrinkflation is the phenomena of companies changing their product sizes, offerings, volumes, whatever, in order to compensate, or at least to somehow survive an inflationary situation, something like that. I don't know if there's been a formal definition yet, but let's run with that. I think that's not a bad idea. People complain about it, of course, but what I see companies do who are successful was they stopped promising the same thing. When the world changes, you need to update your promises and change your delivery and change your value proposition. And if you don't adapt, one of the best ways to adapt to a supply problem is adjust your demand issue and manage demand differently. And sometimes you can't do anything about the supply. And so you don't just hold up your hands and say, well, that's all we can do. So I think I heard a lot of examples during the pandemic that people pivoted what they were offering and they were able to adapt and respond. And I think so I give them an A for doing that. Again, people may be complaining in some cases, but these are adaptation capabilities. The other thing that was really good was I heard about, like, for instance, General Motors, when they started producing ventilators. They pivoted to that a lot quicker than they thought they could. And post-pandemic, they realized, wow, why don't we do that for everything? Why can't we do that for everything? So I think there's the companies that have reflected post-pandemic on what they were able to do and lock in those learnings for other more routine product design decisions and whatnot, get an A. I mean, they're doing great. I mean, you take advantage of that learning. I would say the ones that were slow to respond, the ones that basically put up the signs. I walked into pharmacies that said, "Sorry, pharmacies closed. We're all out of our drugs. We're all out of our supplies." They get an F because there's this sense of inability to see and start investing when the early warning signals occur, and that lack of agility was F worthy.
Oh, thank you. And this point about shrinkflation is a little bit more complicated. I like that people are very innovative in terms of decreasing the size, but the lack of transparency and not only the transfer of price reduction, but then also price increase, causing profit making.
Oh, come on, Hitendra, please. You're complaining that businesses are trying to make money.
No,
that's unbelievable.
It's bordering on profiteering. That's where it's a communication part.
And they labeled. They didn't lie on the labeling. They changed it from 18 ounces to 15 and a half.
Then they should openly say that we are going to do that, and this is an oligopoly, and we are going to do what we want to do, and customers, you cannot do anything about it. But a separate topic.
They have a choice. Buy a different product.
Yeah. So I would recommend to Chris, we have a separate podcast on shrinkflation. Arash, what are your thoughts? What would the grade you will give?
Oh, goodness. It's all over the board. With or without pandemic, I mean, what do we have in our minds right now? Baby milk powder, right? This is an F with many regards, both in terms of structure. How in the heck did we set up a system that's reliant on so little number of providers? And furthermore, how do we not have any kind of a response plan for that? Tom had excellent examples of, larger size organizations. There is quite a number of distilleries that switched over and started to make, hand sanitizers right after. So they certainly get an A. Who else gets a lower grade? I could never understand the whole toilet paper issue, right? It's not like our digestive systems really changed right after the pandemic. Maybe some people got nervous, but overall, so then why did we run out of toilet paper? It was simply a supply chain and distribution issue because folks were not in schools and universities and offices. And so, that hopefully the Kimberly-Clarks of the world or Boise Cascades of the world or others have recognized that they need to be much more flexible with switching over their product lines. So we'll have to test to see how they're responsive they are. I'd like to think that more organizations are putting together plans, business continuity plans and whatnot, to be able to respond, in terms of flexibility and agility, like Tom was saying. So the jury's still out. Here's the issue. I'll mention one other thing that's very, very important. Businesses, just like human beings, the psychology is time-based. Here in New Jersey, the year after Hurricane Katrina, guess what happened to the number of folks that bought flood insurance. It went up 5-fold.
Wow.
Right? Okay, so what happened the year after that? It dropped to 4-fold. What happened the year after that? It dropped to 3-fold. By 5 years after Katrina, guess what happened? Folks went back to the number of folks that were worried about flood insurance went back to the way things were. So unfortunately, we have this residual that only lasts for a while. And I'm not sure if COVID is going to be similar to the other ones, but I sure as heck hope that, in 15 years, my kids are going to say, oh, we passed that. We're not going to see that again. And we go back to having even the White House decimate the pandemic response group. So those are the things that are concerning is, they might get an A organizational wise for the time being, but that's not the issue, right? Because risk doesn't have a timeline or, right? The button can be pushed anytime.
Kevin, any thoughts?
I think the pandemic showed that we've gotten an A+ in optimizing the wrong system. So we got an A+, but it was the wrong course. And it's not true that we had completely thinned out. So for example, average inventories, which had met a low, let's say in the early 2000s after the lean manufacturing paradigm came in, did go back up. And I think that there was some rationalization around safety stocks and things like that. And we know how much has been invested in inventory tracking and supply chain visibility and traceability. I'll give you the question for a company. Show me a manager in your company whose performance is being measured on something other than inventory turns and cost reduction. Show me someone who actually is getting measured on the amount of safety that they're bringing to the supply chain. And I'll give them an A.
Well, and to that point, let me just add very quickly, the common saying in risk management is nobody becomes a hero because of an event that did not occur. Right. It's right. So sometimes crisis management, if you really want to make a name for yourself, you almost regrettably Machiavellian way, you almost have to make it happen. And then you become Rudy Giuliani. Not that he, nothing against him, but that's essentially how it happens. Right. So the system, unfortunately, doesn't reward firefighters that are, avoided. Maybe the firefighters get recognized, but the fire inspectors never get recognized, right?
Yeah, that's a great analogy. Fantastic analogy. My last question, and I'll start with Kevin. I know technology always play a very important role in risk management. The new age technology, let's talk about the new age technology. Is it helping or hurting risk management? When I say new age, AI, big data, robotic process automation and blockchain and so on and so forth. So 3 ways technology is helping or hurting risk management. I'll start with Kevin and then Thomas, and then we will close this session with Arash.
All right. At first, when you said new age, I thought, ambient music. And yes, ambient music is very important for any risk manager, no doubt. I'm going to go the opposite way. So of course, technology will continue for a while to be a differentiator, digitization and whatnot, tracking technology. And that will continue to be a differentiator from the leaders to the rest of the pack. But that advantage will diminish over time as standardization and things become more affordable for the midstream. And so I'm going to go back and say, it's actually going to make relationships more important. So as technology improves and really kind of brings the best that can to the table, the difference is what do you have relationally? And I like to think of the 3-step process of traceability, transparency, and trust. If you don't get to that 3rd stage, then you're still just in a transaction mode.
Very interesting point. Thomas, anything to add?
I think tech is a great way for a manager to show off their stuff. And it doesn't really necessarily mean they're doing anything about it, the real issue. But tech seems to be a nice way to at least, because Arash alluded to this. It's hard to really show success in a risk manager's boat. So by having a lot of activity around tech, I think that does help reduce their employment risk. I don't know if it does anything about the company. The one thing that the biggest downside is, like I said before many times, if I overpromise and underdeliver, that I've created risk simply by overpromising. And if I look at tech and I think it can do a lot more than it actually can, any ERP sales rep would creates lots of risk in any organization, and evangelical tech people create lots of risk in any organization simply because overpromise and then inevitable underdeliver. And I think that is the biggest risk with tech.
Thank you.
But it can be useful as long as candor and knowledge is there.
Arash, do you want to close this with your thoughts?
Sure. I would have to echo both Kevin and Tom's point here is that I love technology. It's great, be it artificial intelligence, blockchain, whatever else. The issue is when it becomes a security blanket or a safety blanket. And we use it to hide behind to say, well, the system didn't tell me. And so, garbage in, garbage out, even with artificial intelligence, right? As smart as it is, ultimately, it's based on what it has observed. And we haven't been able to emulate what the cerebral cortex or whatever else in our mind does to recognize patterns and whatnot that could be beneficial. So again, it's the analogy is the same thing as outsourcing. We're outsourcing logic to technology, and so that we are pushing away and pulling out and getting ourselves some safety. And that's not the case, right? The manager and the decision makers have to be in charge. So technology is great as an enabler, but not as a replacement to human mind.
Thank you. What an amazing conversation. And we are perfectly on time, by the way. Gentlemen, this has been a pleasure. And I wish this discussion can continue, including shrinkflation, Thomas, and technology, Arash. But we'll have to stop it at here. And again, thank you for everybody at ASU, Arash. Great to have you here. And gentlemen, Thomas, Kevin, pleasure to have you as always. And with that, I will call it a close. Thank you.
Hitendra.
Right.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you for joining the Chain Reaction Podcast, brought to you by the Department of Supply Chain Management at Arizona State University's W.P. Carey School of Business. Please reach out to us at wpcarey.scm@asu.edu with SCM news and concepts you would like us to discuss in a future installment of the Chain Reaction Podcast. And remember to check out the SCM Department website. Thank you for joining us, and we hope to see you again for our next Chain Reaction release.